Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in from around the world. We are delighted to be part of the Global Terrorism Index launch. This is, I believe, the 7th time we have done it here at the GCSP. The GCSP has been proud to collaborate with the Institute for Economics and Peace since 2015 in helping to contribute both substantively and in helping to launch multiple editions of the Global Terrorism Index. The state of global security and governance has reached a climactic point in human history. Multiple factors are feeding this downturn, including the new geopolitics, conflicts, climate change, new technologies, the fragility of states, and transnational crime. These factors are enabling violent non-state actors to thrive. 2 decades after September 11th attacks, the United States and the West have lost their appetite for counterinsurgency, stabilization, and state-building efforts. And the West has become increasingly unwelcome in West Africa and the Sahel and regions that have become the epicenters of terrorism. Governments are still trying to find better solutions in both preventing and countering violent extremism and terrorism. Modern terrorism has become a global problem that needs a global solution. Chronic instability, civil wars, the global shock of the pandemic, and the continued climate disasters have created a complex landscape of intertwined risks that have reversed hard-won development gains. Not only are these dynamics affecting people's lives within these countries, but they are also destabilizing countries. They're causing transboundary effects that compel all of us to think and act in new ways. Fragility, conflict, and violence is a global challenge. By 2030, almost 60% of the world's poor will live in countries classified as fragile and conflict affected. For the last 2 decades, terrorism has exposed the entire planet to multiple threats posed by operations carried out by terrorist groups both in the real and virtual worlds. 2023 will certainly be remembered for Hamas's unexpectedly large assault from the air, sea, and land, and cyber, on southern Israel on October 7th. However, Israel's heavy-handed response will feed terrorism for decades to come. During the first 4 weeks alone, Israel killed over 10,000 civilians, including some 4,000 children. At the same time, almost 1 million of Gaza's 2.3 million population were dislocated, generating a huge humanitarian crisis. The Hamas attack on October 7th energized transnational Islamist threat networks, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Jenim, AQAP, and Al-Shabaab, celebrating the attacks, while AQ urged Muslims everywhere to take part in the fighting in Gaza. The attack has also heightened the risk of disruptive cyber and violent attacks in North America and Europe, with increases in hate crime targeting Jewish, Muslim, and Arab communities by individuals driven by personal beliefs and advocating of violence by extremist and terrorist groups. There's also been an increased cyber threat worldwide, as well as information manipulation and interference by state-sponsored groups, foreign and domestic extremist groups who create and share misleading, false, and hateful narratives. These have made our cities more unsafe and is creating fear and trepidation among our recent immigrant and minority groups. As we will learn today from our experts here in the room and online, that there are several reasons why terrorism will persist into our foreseeable future. I will now introduce our panelists, Serge Stroobants, Isako Ouedraogo, and Kevin Osborne. Kevin Osborne is an American from Washington, D.C. with 17 years of multidisciplinary experience living and working in Haiti, Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Switzerland. In his current role with the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, GCSP, he oversees GCSP's grant making and grant management globally. Kevin has thematic expertise in repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration programming of third country nationals from Northeast Syria, and has published extensively on the topic with members of the GCSP partnership. Mr. Isako Wadrago is a former executive fellow of the GCSP, where he frequently speaks and teaches about West African geopolitics. He is the director of Sahel Politica, a Swiss-based political risks analysis consultancy advising government and corporate clients on how West African geopolitics affects their strategies and operations so that they can seize opportunities for profitable growth and positive social impact. He is also a foresight practitioner with a broad experience spanning over 17 years at the intersection of intelligence, policy analysis, and African affairs. His extensive experience includes roles such as serving over 7 years within the Swiss Army's Center for Electronic Operations and acting as deputy team leader at the Africa desk of the Federal Intelligence Service's Strategic Analysis Division. And finally, Serge Stroobants, who has always been here at the GCSP and is here now with us digitally, is the Director of Operations for Europe and the MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace. He's a former colonel in the Belgian Armed Forces with academic specializations in political sciences, international relations, security, and defense. He also works on global risk analysis and foresight and crisis management. He is a fellow at the Atlantic Treaty Association and the Global Governance Institute. He is a senior associate at the European Institute for Asian Studies and the Global Institute for Cybersecurity Technologies, and founder of BANS Consulting, his own strategic security consultancy company. Thank you so much, Serge, for being with us today. Even though you are not here physically, we are delighted to have you here. So please, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to hearing the Global Terrorism Index 2020-24 report's findings.
Well, thank you very much for a kind introduction, and thank you very much, Christina, for putting such a great panel together into the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, for, as you said, in a continuous way, host launch events for the research results of the Institute for Economics and Peace, being this Global Terrorism Index, and with your colleagues also the Global Peace Index and the Ecological Threat Report. So I don't know if we could share my PowerPoint presentation. There it is. And then from there, I will present to you the results of this year's Global Terrorism Index 2024, of course, based on the data collected last year in 2023, as you mentioned. So let's go. Next. So first, a few words on the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we are an independent, not-for-profit, completely independent think tank. What we try to do is measure and quantify peace and identify also the drivers of peace. And once you get into a more peaceful situation, also identify the economic benefits coming along with this more peaceful and more resilient situation. Next. So we are an Australian think tank based in Sydney, Australia, but with the distribution offices throughout the world. I'm heading the office in Brussels. We are responsible for the regions Europe, Middle East, North Africa, and a lot of countries speaking French and Portuguese, as we have this capacity in the office. The office in Harare is on its way moving to Kenya to come closer to decision makers and policy makers and be more effective over there. And we have with a similar representation in the Americas with an office in New York, close to the United Nations, but also Washington, D.C., basically global and US decision makers and policy makers. And we have also a regional office in Mexico City. Why Mexico City? Because in Mexico, that's the only country in which we produce a national peace index ranking the 32 Mexican states according to their levels of peacefulness. Next. So this is just a slide showing you the efforts we are putting into making sure that the result of our research, especially the core research, which we consider being a public good, is reaching a maximum of people. And when we have identified 3 potential audiences there, which would be a general audience like we have today, although I think at GCSP and in Geneva, we have also a set of really specialists sitting in the room and following us online. An academic, the second audience would be the academic audience. And of course, we are represented in a variety of courses throughout the world, and our citations in books also and in research papers. And third of all, it's policymakers and decision makers. What we want to do is that all public good core research serves as a basis for proper and well underpinned decision making and policy making, and also legislation development. And as you can see, next to the core research, we also do some specific consultancy research for governments, international organizations throughout the world, making sure that we can provide all those policymakers and decision makers with the right data and the right analysis and the right research. Next. As I said, next to the Global Terrorism Index, we have 3 more main publications. The Global Peace Index, 11 June. That's the next date of release. Ecological Threat Report, around October, November. And our Positive Peace Research, which is basically a conceptual systemic definition of peace research being done on a more longer term also. You can follow us on our website, visionofhumanity.org. We have a weekly future trends newsletter, really looking at things happening today, but having an impact in the future. You can always become an IP ambassador, and you can, of course, get trained in Positive Peace online with our Positive Peace Academy. Next. So let's get into what the Global Terrorism Index is and also the results for this year. Next. So this is the 12th edition of the Global Terrorism Index. We still rank one of the 63 countries like we do for the Global Peace Index. And, you know, this Global Terrorism Index, or at least the relative impact of terrorism, which is measured here, is one of the 23 indicators we are using in the Global Peace Index. So we developed it ourselves with a panel of international experts. Next. So just to set a little bit of the methodology, set the scene. So to make sure that we remain consistent, what we do is using a very accurate and a very developed database, and that's the terrorism tracker by Dragonfly. This is based on the data collection, the collection of the incidents and people getting killed and injured and taken hostages into those incidents. Well, that's done according to a definition. The definition you see up there, which is, I mean, we are in social sciences, so we need to put a definition to make sure that we are consistent in the way we are collecting the data. And you will see that the most elements, or the major elements of what terrorism is could be, is represented in this definition, of course, with the focus on non-state actors. So we take this data set, push it through the filter of 4 indicators, all with a different weight. What we also do is take the results, of course, half of the impact of the results for the past 5 years. Why? Just to create this idea, or just to picture or display this idea of the psychological effect, also the long-lasting effect of a terrorist attack on a population and in a social system. And of course, we add some socioeconomic indicators. We do work as statisticians and researchers, and we produce a Global Terrorism Index doing so. Next. So let's go into the results. Next. So this is a map you can find back on our website. And of course, at the first look, at the first glance, you can clearly already identify the countries in dark red, which are the most impacted countries by terrorism. You see the first concentration there in the Sahel region, but also still in the MENA region in South Asia, and some external data like Colombia in Southern America. What you could do on our website, this is an interactive map, so you can click on each of the countries and access the data per country. So for those who are doing research in the field, that's a very interesting resource. Next. So about the key findings, 2023 is the year with the highest impact since 2017. So just after the peak that we have seen in the years 14, 15, 16, this is the next peak. And what we expect for 2024 is to see a new peak in 2024. Why? We see 3 main elements there which could lead to that. We have seen in the past 4 to 5 years that the figures in the Sahel became, I would say, worse and worse every year. So there's a continuous degradation of the situation there, and we expect that to continue in 2024. So when we see countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, but also Niger being more impacted and creating more incidents and casualties than the year before. So that's one thing. Of course, what's happening in Gaza, and you have clearly said it, Christina, in your introduction, this is going to generate more terrorism in the region, or more violence in the region, potentially crystallizing in terrorism for the months and the years to come. That is pretty clear. Everybody knows this. And third of all, we see that elections will be held in more than 50 countries in the world, basically impacting more than half of the world population. And a lot of those elections, or so-called elections, depending on the countries in which they happen, well, will happen in countries which are not completely stable, countries in which there is a high level of political instability and polarization. And so these elections could generate also some forms of violence, of which terrorism could be a form. So we see three key elements there, which could spark off a new peak in 2024. What we have seen last year is that even without the Hamas attack on the October 7th, well, the death toll from terrorism would still have risen by 5%. So even if we take this outbound data, because that's what it is in the figures and the numbers, well, if we look at the global terrorism as such, still we will have seen an increase in terrorism in the past year. Finally, what we clearly see is that the epicenter of terrorism is now completely moved from the MENA region, where it basically emerged in the past 10, 15 years, or where the largest impact was in the past 10, 15 years. And it's now clearly concentrated in the Sahel, in the three, these three countries that I explained, that I spoke about before, with a pressure on the neighboring countries like Ghana, like Togo, like Benin, like Cote d'Ivoire, and others. What we also see, and that's maybe good news for other parts of the world, is that terrorism in Western democracy is at the lowest level in 15 years. And that's really a good sign. But as you have said, Christina, also, there is a risk there to see spillovers from other regions and again impact in the West. Next. So a very specific phenomenon happened last year. So we have seen that the death toll from terrorism had risen to more than 8,300 casualties, which is an increase by 22%. At the same time, we have seen that the number of attacks decreased by 23%, so to just over 3,350. So what we see there is that the terrorist attacks as such are becoming more lethal and more concentrated. So, of course, we have an increase of deadliness, up to 2.5 deaths per attack, which is higher than the 1.6 of the year before. So clearly more casualties per attack. But we also see that the number of countries where there was one attack or one casualties also decreased over the past year. So we really see a concentration of the phenomenon and a higher, I would say, lethality or lethal rate per attack. Next. So, of course, the Hamas-led attack of October 7th was the deadliest terrorist attack since 9/11. I think that's clearly something which we need to take into account. But as you have said, since then, more than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed during Israeli military action, and it continues on a daily basis. And of course, we have seen the military operations, but we also see the humanitarian and I would say security situation for Palestinians on the ground, the most dense populated part of the world, in which you are going to launch a massive and full-scale military operation with the results we have seen in the past 4 to 5 months. Burkina Faso is the country most impacted by terrorism, with deaths rising by almost 70% there to over 1,900. Israel is second, but of course, as I said, it's one attack, can be seen as an outbound data. And it's the first time since we created the Global Terrorism Index that neither Iraq or Afghanistan has been ranked first on the index. And as we could see, it's not only Burkina Faso, but it's also other countries like Mali and Niger, the same Sahel region, which are really climbing up in the Global Terrorism Index there, next to a country like Pakistan. And for a couple of years now, we have seen that, especially in the region Balochistan, there is an increase in the use of terrorism there for political and nationalist reasons. Next. Well, that's another visualization of the impact of terrorism. Clearly there, the countries in the Sahel region, we still have an impact in the Horn of Africa and Eastern DRC. The MENA region, of course, with this peak in Israel, and then, as I said, South Asia, countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, but also, I would say, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar and other countries. Thank you. Next. Well, we look at the most active terrorist group, it's clear that the Islamic State is still there. And of course, this is over a period of about 16 years. What we also see is, of course, the Taliban is not there anymore. Why? Because we do not consider the Taliban as a non-state actor. They are now leading a state. They are now in power. They conducted a very successful insurgency and took power in Afghanistan. So that's why they are not on the Global Terrorism Index anymore. What we can also see is what we are putting into place now is really the use of machine learning to attributed, non-attributed attacks also. And then you can see that the estimations there are really considered, are really giving us a more accurate idea of which group is or was most impacted over the period of 15 years. Clearly, the Islamic State, followed by the Taliban, which for a couple of years now do not generate any data anymore for the GTI, and then we can continue with AQI, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, JNIM, and others. So clearly there, a good estimation of the most active terrorist group. Next. Well, that's the top 10 of the Global Terrorism Index. So Burkina Faso, number 1, Israel really pushed up to the second level by this one attack on October 7th. More consistent in the top 10 would be Mali, Pakistan, and of course, some countries in the MENA region and Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, we see Myanmar also there. Because why? Because, you know, this popular, I would say, reaction to the junta in Myanmar is using those terrorist tactics in a form of insurgency also. Afghanistan is dropping. Why? Because, of course, this half value of the Taliban attacks is decreasing every year. There are still other forms of terrorism going on in Afghanistan, of course, with the Islamic State, Khorasan chapter, and other groups in Afghanistan, but the impact is much lower than in times of the Taliban also. Next. Well, we can definitely see that the death in the 5 most impacted countries increased by 66%. So that's really incredible, while at the same time, in the rest of the world, there was a decrease by 13.5% of all deaths over there. So we can clearly see that terrorism is becoming more and more geographically concentrated. Next. And basically the concentration is in the top 10 countries. We see that 87% of all deaths occur in the top 10 countries. And as you can see, it's really the top 2, 3, 4, 5, which are considered most impacted by terrorism. The rest of the world, so basically all the other 153 countries only account for 13% of the global relative impact of terrorism. Next. The same thing when we look at the increases. So, of course, Israel, I already explained what this could be. Burkina Faso, Niger, that's clearly something which is much more consistent. And of course, then you see, as I said before, other countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region. But clearly the conflicts which are emerging with a sort of violence called terrorism, which is part of the emerging conflicts. Next. So the good news, of course, I already explained Afghanistan why this is happening, because the Taliban is not on the counter anymore. Somalia, very good news over there, so very positive to see this evolution. Same thing for Mali, but you will see later on, I will show you a slide in which you see the relative impact of different forms of violence and the number of casualties this is generating. So when you look at Mali, of course, there is a decrease, but I think what you need to understand, and I'm really glad that we have a specialist of the region which maybe could go into more details there, is that other forms of violence have taken over, I would say, the central role, the central piece in the conflict over there. We have seen that this is a country, for example, where the counterterrorism actions are creating much more casualties than terrorism itself. So we really need to put that into the right perspective and understand that there is still a conflict going on, that there's still a lot of high use of violence in these countries, which could definitely also generate a lot of casualties, which could not be attributed to terrorism anymore, but definitely are linked as such to the use of terrorism in the country. Next. Well, let's have a look at the trends. Basically, next, open the time window to maybe 15 or 20 years time window. Yeah, next slide, please. Well, this graph is showing you the evolution since 2007, so basically 15 to 16 years. And you can clearly see that the peak I was talking about in 2015-16, as you can see, you can also see that since 2016, this is the highest level in 2023, the highest level of impact of terrorism. You could see with the gray part there, the increase of the importance of the Sahel region in this graph, and the decrease of all the other regions in this graph also over the same period of time. And I think what I always refer to when I see this slide is the gray part at the bottom. Basically, what you are looking at there is the basic level of terrorism that you will find back globally. Of course, you have peak in certain regions, or in certain regions where you see the concentration of terrorism, But this is a global phenomenon which has an impact globally also, and that's basically this light gray zone on the bottom of the graph. Next. Well, same thing when you look at the region per regions, you can clearly see there that Sub-Saharan Africa today is suffering more terrorism than South Asia and MENA combined. So when you look at the three most impacted regions, where MENA region was first before, and definitely South Asia with the conflict in Afghanistan and the situation in Pakistan also. Well, those two regions have been surpassed in the past 4 to 5 years by the Sahel region and Sub-Saharan Africa. It's not only the Sahel, but the Sahel is really the concentration there. We see that more than 50% of all terrorist attacks occur in the Sahel region. Well, when you see that there is more activity there now, really defining the epicenter, than in the two next most impacted regions. I think that's really, mind-blowing when you see this. Next. As I said, the lowest, in my introduction, in the past 15 years, the lowest level or the lowest impact of terrorism in the West, and confirming the trend of the past years, and you can see it clearly on the graph also, the vastest or the largest potential impact coming from political form of terrorism, so far right, far left, definitely much more impactful than religious and other forms of terrorism in the West. So clearly, political terrorism impacting the West, but the lowest level in 15 years, so that's good news. Next. Let's look at some properties of terrorism. Next. That's what I explained to you before. So terrorism is, of course, impactful and is creating the number of casualties. But still, if the number of casualties is high, and don't get me wrong here, those more than 8,000 people who died by terrorism last year should not have died in those attacks. And I'm a member here in Belgium of an organization called V Europe, which is really serving the survivors of terrorist attacks. And it's a lot of work, and it's really a necessary work also done by this organization. And yeah, every attack that we can prevent, or every casualty that we can prevent, that's good work. So don't get me wrong when I'm showing this, but when you look at the impact in the number of casualties by terrorism, it's really, I would almost call it marginal compared to a conflict, and definitely other forms of violence in which people get killed also. So we need to put that in a certain form, in a certain comparison, in a certain relation to other forms of violence. Next. Let's have a look also at the impact of October 7th. I think we were in a certain mindset before October 7th, where peace might have had a chance in the region. Of course, this peace effort, so the peace mindset, has completely been destroyed by those attacks. Of course, generating in the first stage, I would say, generating the first stage, a change of mindset within the Israeli population or public opinion. So clearly the feelings of sadness, stress, and also worry, which increased. But I think now that we are in the second phase there, I mean, that's basically my own opinion, following on those figures, where there is some form of reaction also, yes, and an answer needed to be given. But I think now that the Israeli population is also realizing that a solution needs to be achieved also for Gaza, and of course for the relation between Israel and the Palestinian authorities or the Palestinian people. Next. Well, let's have a quick look at the terrorism in the Sahel, but I won't go into much detail and really leave the floor to my fellow panelists to talk about this. Yes. Next. We can clearly see there, since 2020, the shift from the MENA region to the Sahel. And when I say the Sahel, please have a look at the map. It's not even, the entire Sahel. It's not even the entire countries of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. It's really this border region most impacted. And we don't have the slides this year, but in the past years we have showed this. What you're looking at there is basically at the geolocalization of the intersection of a wide variety of strategic factors influencing peace and security, intersecting at the same geolocation. So you will see that this is also the region, or this is also the geographical zone in which you will have the highest number of casualties by normal conflict, by armed conflict. This is also the zone when you will have the lowest level of governance, the highest level of famine, maybe also the highest demographic development. And so everything that could influence peace and security will intersect in the same very, very specific geographical location. So I think it's difficult to say that's the entire Sahel. it's even difficult to say that some of the countries or complete countries. It's really very specific geolocation in which you see the intersection and the interaction of all those strategic factors influencing peace and security. Next. Clearly, there again, when you look at the Sahel over the past 16 years, and that's represented, this dark gray zone that was increasing on the evolution trends that I showed before. What we see there also is a distribution of the different countries, and Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in the past years are clearly the countries most impacted. But what are we looking at? Is Mali and Niger the first place? Mali and Burkina Faso, sorry, in the first place. Niger is also there, and then other countries in the region. But as this is showing basically this central Sahel region and its very specific geolocation that I was talking about before. Next. Research. We have done research also, very specific research about the connection between organized crime and terrorism across the world, and we are doing this in coordination with UNODC, which also produced an expert article on the matter in this Global Terrorism Index. We see that both terrorism and organized crime are high in the Sahel region. Basically, to understand the Sahel region, and I'm really looking forward, as I said, to my fellow panelists to talk about this, we see that the same people can be an organized crime group on Monday, use terrorist tactics on the Tuesday, and maybe be just like criminals on the Wednesday. So the same type of people in this kind of low governance and low rule of law impacted regions, where all those strategic factors intersect. Well, this is where a certain group of people can move from one to the other and have and create the impact of different forms of violence and different forms of destabilization in one region or in one very specific location. Next. There again, organized crime in the Sahel region. So we see a clear increase for the past 5-6 years of the kidnapping, and also a lot of events around gold mining. So I did not put it as such when I was talking about the intersection, but it's also in where you see this intersection that you will find a lot of natural resources for which there is already a conflict going on or there is a fight going on. So clearly they're gold, but also other forms of natural resources. And those natural resources sometimes can just be food and water also. So it's not only, those rare metals, rare earth, or gold or other resources. It's basically also basic resources for which there could be conflict, there could be a fight. Well, in the past up to 5 years, we see a clear increase of these international organized crime activities around those geolocations. So clearly, there's a full interaction of everything what can go wrong. Next. Well, that's the end of my presentation. As said, you can follow us on visionofhumanity.org, which is our main website. The Positive Peace Academy is still available for you on this website also. And you can follow either the Institute for Economics and Peace on the usual social media, and you can follow myself using my own name, supporting the efforts of communication of the Institute for Economics and Peace also. So again, thank you for giving me the chance to present the result of our research. Unfortunately, I could not be with you in Geneva, but I will do my best to make sure to be there again in June, live in Geneva. So thank you so much, and I will be more than happy to answer your questions at the end of the discussion. And I'm really looking forward to the input of the other two panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview of the 2024 Global Terrorism Index. I'm now going to ask the panelists to get some of their reactions from the report and to discuss also their specific expertise. First of all, I just wanted to highlight, we've seen, and you highlighted as well, Serge, how democracy is weakening in West Africa and the Sahel, especially in the last couple of decades. We've seen in the last, since 2020, 7 coups d'etats. 4 have been successful. The most recent was in Niger in July 2023. And there were also successful coups d'etats in Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mali. we saw from the Global Terrorism Index report that Burkina Faso has become one of the most impacted countries in the region. I wanted to ask you, Isaka Ouedraogo, what do you think about Burkina Faso, and why do you think it has become the most impacted by terrorism in the region? And possibly also discuss a little bit how you think the military or the government has been in terms of responding to this crisis in Burkina Faso.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Mr. Stroobants, for this presentation. I find the findings of the report quite factual, since it's based on incident statistics. It's a good question. Why or how did Burkina Faso become the guest star on your report, dethroning Iraq, Afghanistan, and while Mali, which is the historic starting point of the jihadi insurrections since a decade and more, was less impacted. And if I take a look at Niger, for instance, Niger is battling terrorism on two fronts. First, on the border with Nigeria, battling Boko Haram, and on the three border area that you highlighted on your map, battling Geneva and the Islamic State. So it may seem surprising that Burkina Faso is the most impacted, but to me, it's not much a surprise, because I argue that Burkina Faso has been along the weakest link in the three countries in regard to vulnerability to terrorism. And I also think that it's maybe a consequence of lesser attention to Burkina Faso since the beginning of the insurrection. The focus has been a lot on Mali and Niger. So what made Burkina Faso the weakest links for long? I think, as Stroobants quietly highlighted, there is a nexus of drivers and factors at the three border area, and both external factors, but a lot of internal factors that we may go into. For instance, if I take a look at the internal factors, it's clear that the military, even before the start of the insurrection, experimented a lot of internal divisions. You have division between the top brass and the soft officers and the troop. It's not a surprise that if you take a look at the coup d'etats, you went, for instance, in Burkina Faso from a lieutenant colonel to a captain in the hierarchy. So there is also opposition sometimes between different components of the army. There may be tension between the air component, the terrestrial component, but also with the gendarmerie and the police. And add to that, that now, for instance, for Burkina Faso, for the first time, there is a pupil militia, civilians that were registered as auxiliaries to the army, numbering like 90,000 since 2023. There are challenges in how you integrate in the chain of command civilians, how you indoctrinate them regarding humanitarian law, human rights, and so on. So add to that political instability. Political instability means, in the case of Burkina Faso, there was a first coup at the beginning of 2022. That's meant change in the structure of command, in the deployment structure, in also the doctrine, the tactics, and change also in commanding personnel, because when the military arrived, the structure that was in place, they didn't trust it. So they had to change all of that and conceive new structures and so on. This takes time, resources, and at the same time, this leaves the terrorist initiative. If I take a look at the external factors, last week, I think Niger asked politely the United States to pack up and leave with the 2,000 strong military and to close the Agadez bases, which is one of the most important drone bases of the US. And it created a lot of worry because from here we see that it may create a vacuum, a security vacuum that will be gladly filled by Islamic State and Geneva. So our worry indicates that we believe that the military presence and activity there against the jihadists had a positive impact. And I argue heretically that during the last 12 years, this attention has been put a lot on Mali and Niger for force generation, for training, for equipment, and Burkina Faso had less attention on that. Let me give you a couple of numbers. Remember that if we look at the land areas, Burkina Faso is only 274,000 square kilometers with a population of 22 million, but with an armed force that till 2022 was only 18,000 armed force, all components included. It was not until 2023 that you had the militia that numbered 90,000. That means the ratio of the armed force to the militia is like fourfold. So the professional army is only 18,000. Compare it to Niger, 1,026,000 square kilometers. It's huge. And battling terrorists on two fronts. But still, they had like 33,000 armed force. The ratio is not very good, but still, it's better than Burkina Faso. And then you have Mali, 1,022,000 square kilometers with, I think there were like 44,000 armed forces with a population of 21. Then I go to the international military support and the regional military support in Mali and Niger. In Mali, you had MINUSMA with a lot of bases in the northern part. The Malian junta and the Burkinabe and Nigerian junta may complain that they want the international force out, but it still had an effect. You had 15,000 MINUSMA troops equipped that was patrolling in the north. They may not have not been fighting the terrorists, but it had an impact on stabilization. Add to that Barkhane forces, 15,000 or more fighting troops equipped with a lot of capability. Add to that G5 style with Chadian troops, 1,200 deployed in Niger, but mostly active in Mali. Niger, as I said, had the biggest US base that was doing drone strike. So my heretical view is that paradoxically, by their own maybe fault, but also by the fault of the international and regional partnership, Burkina Faso had less emphasis and less support than they wanted or did not want it, or the type that they wanted. So I find it interesting because all of this created a fertile ground in this weak link, which is still the bulwark that are retaining the terrorists to expand in the Gulf states, in the Gulf of Guinea state. And if it falls, it will create havoc. The problem is that looking at the last 2 years, the domestic politics in Burkina Faso and the regional politics, I'm citing ECOWAS exit, I'm citing exit from G5 Sahel, which mean that cooperation, military cooperation with other states are not optimal, create less efficiency in defense and security counterterrorism strategies in Burkina Faso. So to me, it's not that much surprising. For me, what's left to see is if the new structures they put in place with the alliance of Sahelian state that has a military component intended to replace G5 Sahel would be viable and successful enough to make the difference in 2024. Regarding the efficiency of the government political and military response to terrorism, there again, paradoxically, I want to highlight to assess that you need to understand the theory of change from which Burkina Faso government and to some extent Mali and Niger are operating. It's simple, some will argue simplistic. It may not align to the way we see things, but it's important to understand it. From their point of view, the problem is counterterrorism is ineffective because civilian governments are corrupt, incompetent, and sold to Western interests. Second, regional partners, ECOWAS, do counterterrorism with liberal constraints because they think also that military assistance is first not sincere, conditional to some interests, but also alienating. And mostly they think that the city doctrine that Western and regional partners wanted them to implement is too soft, not robust enough, and the tactics are not strong enough. Assumption being that the liberal model doesn't suit them politically, and the counterterrorism doctrine is too liberal for them, that they feel more closer to BRIC countries, and that the approach from states like Russia, which use a strong hand in Chechnya and to crush terrorism, suit them more. So, from their point of view, the required interventions is that, okay, let's get the Western partner out. Let's get out of the ECOWAS because it's limiting our political autonomy since military want to remain in power. Let's get as much as Russian weapons as we can, and let's do counterterrorism with a little less consideration for humanitarian concerns and human rights concern and civic political rights concern. Because don't forget that they look also at what's happening in the world. They look at how Israel respond in Gaza. They look at how the war in Ukraine is dealt with. So, for instance, for PVE, they are not interested right now in negotiating with the terrorists. The Prime Minister of Burkina Faso said as much. We will not negotiate. We want them to surrender. And we'll do elections when security is back. We want law and order first, and then we'll deal with democracy later. Hence, the restrictions, for instance, on civic space that you can observe. You may have read in the press that some political opposition leaders, journalists, and human rights activists were conscripted to the front lines. It's a way not only to police dissent, but also to indicate that the political regime that they want to implement is a nationalistic one that will not use liberal standards. So I'll stop here because I could go on for forever.
Perhaps you can just add one more point. I want to ask you, so given what you've just said, do you think Burkina Faso will remain one of the most volatile places in the Sahel?
Yeah, this is my nightmare at night. I worry a lot about that. Will Burkina Faso remain in the top ranking this year and next year and beyond? Looking at the trends from the GTI perspective, I think the trends, it's unlikely that the trends will be reversed in 2024. Because to the credit of the government in Burkina Faso, before 22, the offensive, the military initiative was in the hand of the jihadis. They started taking on the military offensive using mostly drone airstrikes. And this may correlate to one of the findings of the report that said there is less attacks, but more death tolls. I link that to the aerial pressure that both Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and they are coordinating the airstrikes, have on jihadist group. We have seen it in Somalia and Afghanistan. It may not be the perfect tool to resolve the problem and find a political settlement. If you exclude the PVE dimension, you need that. But still, it has such an effect on the jihadi group that the numbers of attacks diminished. But since they are adapting, this has some limitation. For instance, on 25th of February, this February, there was 9 coordinated attacks in north and northeastern part of Burkina Faso. The casualties were around 200. And also the collateral damage of the reprisal by the army. And this has a link to what something Serge Stroobants was saying, the inattributed death and the link with maybe the armed force and the security force is a big concern. But I think that this will depend, the outlook will depend on at least 3 variables, I think. Will first the 3 regimes in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger remain on power and hold power in 2024? It's not that evident because in Burkina Faso, authority claimed to have thwarted at least 2 coup attempts, which brought them to purge the highest part of the military and the security forces. So that means they are fragile. The economic situation is not good because foreign aid has been cut. Gold mining, formal gold mining, some of the investors are exiting, and fiscal pressure is very up. So there is less money, times are tough. How will you finance a military alliance while we know that the BRICS states, they may sell weapons, but they don't give a lot of development assistance financially. So it will depend also on that. And it will depend, I think, how they are able to do military operations in the 3 border area that Serge Stroobants highlighted. This is where the military alliance may have the biggest effect or failures. And if it fails or one of the regimes fall, all the architecture they're trying to build may fall as well. And we cannot ignore that because the Gulf of Guinea states are next on the line. And as he said, elections are scheduled in Senegal, in Ghana, and next year in Ivory Coast. And given that the same political vulnerability exists in those states, we have to worry. So paradoxically, my worst nightmare would be that there is another coup in Burkina Faso, because that means we have to start from the onset and maybe less, and this will give the terrorists another way to advance. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your very frank and open observations on Burkina Faso, and also for your foresight into the future. Given what we've just heard, I think we need a little bit of hope. So we're going to talk now a little bit on preventing violent extremism, and especially the work of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, which created an article, an expert article on rehabilitation and reintegration work in the report, highlighting the 45,000 people that are prisoners in Al-Hol, a camp in northeast Syria, which is an exceptional place. It's a contested region, but it's also exceptional because these are mostly families of foreign fighters representing I think over 40 different nationalities, and they're there. It seems literally frozen in time. A huge human rights violation. Many of them are children, women and children. So GCSP is doing work on rehabilitation, reintegration, repatriation there, and I wanted you to highlight a little bit on the work that you're doing there, the case management work, and perhaps you could highlight also the combined approach, and really what hope do you have for this program into the future?
Thank you very much, Dr. Liang. And thank you also, Isaka, for making the pitch for prevention. This is very important. GCSP is currently funding grants in 7 out of the top 11 countries on this year's Global Terrorism Index, including the 3 that we were just speaking about. In terms of the repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration work that GCSP has been supporting now for about 5 years. It started in the Western Balkans in 2019, 2020. And very recently, we funded our first grant in Northeast Syria with a local partner, where we will be supporting pre-departure of individuals who their countries are partner countries of GCSP, or they have expressed an interest in pre-departure support for their nationals. So what this means is that we have partner countries, for example, Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, the Philippines, Indonesia, that have written us formal letters asking for our support to bring back their remaining nationals. As time goes by in those detention camps in Northeast Syria, it's harder and harder for people to leave. The situation is becoming increasingly more dangerous and dire from a humanitarian perspective. And people are scared to leave. So what GCSP has been doing for a couple of months now, and we expect there to be an uptick in the repatriations over the next 1 to 2 years, is making contact with individuals in the camps and working with them on expectation management. What will it be like when you return to your country of origin or nationality? The beginnings of case management. And then once they return to their country of nationality or origin, a more in-depth case management approach that involves a social worker, psychosocial support, administrative support, legal support, medical support, educational support, economic empowerment support, economic reintegration. So that's within the context of these third country nationals in Northeast Syria. And we consider this to be critical, supporting these repatriation efforts. One, because right now it still is in the spotlight. I don't know for how much longer this will continue to be in the spotlight, especially with other conflicts in the world today. So it's like we've reached this peak where we have to capitalize on it. And the second reason is that if we don't, what we have is 45,000 people that are ripe for the next revolution or terrorist movement or terrorist movements. And I think this was already mentioned before, what happened on October the 7th and the reverberations, the implications of that situation in the Middle East. And what we have in Northeast Syria, for example, is a breeding ground for terrorist groups and the next wave of terrorist organizations. So this is why we consider it to be critically important. If we don't act, things are going to get a lot worse. And when we think about this blended approach of case management as well as community-based integration, we think about Iraq, which is one of GCSRF's partner countries, number 11 on the list, where GCSRF's grantees in Iraq are supporting the rehabilitation and reintegration of people that are coming out of Jeddah 1, which is the kind of holding transition site in Iraq, one of the transition sites. And when they go back to their community of origin, or maybe it's not their community of origin, but a community that is willing to accept them, there's a lot of work that has to be done on the ground to accept those individuals in communities, especially in the case of Iraq. And similarly, in the case of Yemen, where you have child soldiers. So working with the community on building social cohesion, normalizing these individuals, humanizing them with their peers, and creating acceptance in communities so that rehabilitation and reintegration is in fact possible. It's not a 3-month exercise or a 6-month exercise. It either works or it doesn't exercise. And the only way we know that it works is if 2-3 years later, children have friends across different groups. Men and women are working employment that they find to be meaningful and provides for them, for their families. So in addition to this community-based approach, there's also the case management-based approach. We have as a goal to support the rehabilitation, so psychosocial support, health support, administrative support, educational support for 2,000 Iraqis over the next 2 years. And this will cost roughly around $2,000 per individual. If we think about the costs of that as opposed to doing nothing, they're actually very small. 2 years of support that puts them on the right path to rehabilitation and reintegration and recovering from their trauma, 2,000 a person, it's not very much. And our evidence, at least from the context of the Western Balkans, where we've been doing this work, supporting this work for 4 to 5 years now, is that the prevalence of recidivism is less than 1%. And it's managed even in the cases where there was someone who, for example, may have been identified as still radicalized or maybe engaged in some illegal behavior. So I think, this is one of the challenges that we find with European countries in particular, is making the case that the gains outweigh the risks. That it makes more sense to bring these people back, provide them with a specialized case management-based approach support, than to leave them in a camp in Northeast Syria, for example.
Much, Kevin, for that. And I just also wanted to highlight that for those of you who are very interested in this rehabilitation, reintegration, repatriation, I wanted to shout out that our executive in residence, Cholpan Orzepokova, wrote a book on this, and I would like you to consult it. It's an excellent book, and I think one of the first books, a pioneering work in this field. You mentioned that you were working in other countries on this GCSRF, and you also actually we just recently had a Geneva security debate where we invited GCSRF to present their PVU work worldwide, which I also encourage you to watch. But you mentioned that you are also working in West Africa. And I wanted to ask you, Kevin, why specifically West Africa? And what are the countries that GCSRF is mostly interested in working in at the moment, given the volatility of the region? And what do you hope to achieve there?
Thank you very much for the question. So GCSRF is currently funding grants in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, in Nigeria, as well as Syria. I think that was also in top numbers on the list, and Somalia. But in West Africa, we mentioned a few of them. Mali since 2017, I believe. Burkina since 2020. Niger since 2021. Nigeria, also one of the original ones, 2017-16 when GSURF first started funding grants. I think what is a little bit challenging for GSURF right now is that the resources coming from the states, coming from countries, nations, are increasingly going towards other areas, geographic areas, and it's very hard to find funding support for programming in the Sahel. It's extremely difficult to find funding support for prevention programming in Sahel. And here we have, number 1, number 3, number 5 or 6 on the list that are Sahelian countries. So, GSURF is not going to stop in the Sahel, despite the challenges with resources. We will not stop there. In fact, we're doubling down. We are going through a rigorous needs assessment of the Liptako-Gourma region over the next 6 to 12 months to put forward a new investment strategy for the Sahel. We've also recently brought in Ghana as a GSURF partner country, and we have already invested a substantial amount there and plan to invest almost another $3 million in civil society organizations over the next 9 months as prevention efforts. So just keeping in mind, I think Ghana is like number 89 on this Global Terrorism Index because they haven't had any attacks per se. But at the same time, it is important to keep a region, that region beneath Burkina and around Burkina, the coastal states, as stable as possible. We already see that Benin and Togo are in the top 25. I think they've had a few attacks over the last couple of years. So we would, of course, be looking at an expansion there in the next 1 to 2 years, funding being available. But we wanted to focus our efforts in particular on Ghana and the population movements from Burkina into host communities in northern Ghana. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'm going to now pass the floor back to Isaka. I wanted to, what do you think of Kevin's work? And also, do you also think Ghana is a very important player in the region? And you highlighted, we had a discussion earlier about Togo. What do you see given your excellent foresight knowledge, what do you think are sort of the tipping points in terms of how terrorism can spread, and what can we do now to prevent that from happening? Meaning we, the global community here in Geneva, but also international actors and regional actors like the AU and ECOWAS.
Great one. Followed what Kevin said with delight. I'm happy that you will be intensifying your effort toward West Africa and the Sahel and not giving up on the Sahel, because I also believe that the current attitude of the military regarding PVA may not be definitive. Because right now the motivation is mostly like, I'll dare the comparison. They want to build a rapport de force first against the jihadi, then do PVA. So, which means that a strategic patience on PVA practitioner's part and keeping on engaging may produce results in the middle to long term. Regarding Ghana, I think also it's a good choice. I mentioned the Accra initiative, which was a kind of not formalized military alliance, but an initiative, security initiative that gathered states from the Central Sahel, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, with military from Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. And this initiative was successful in organizing multinational mopping task force during the last 4 years. It had some success in rooting out some of the terrorists in the border area to Ghana. But then it stopped because of the geopolitical ambience right now. And it's a pity that this did not survive. But as Kevin said, there is already a lot of refugees from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in coastal areas like Togo, Benin. There is also a lot of jihadi infiltration in these areas. The report mentioned the nexus between gold mining and terrorism. And this is visible also on the ground. And PVE efforts, prospective effort in countries like Ghana, Togo, and Benin, I think is very important. Because let's take, for instance, Togo. Togo is an interesting country. I don't know if you noticed, they held a diplomatic conference a couple of months before, the Lomé Peace Initiative, because this is an illustration of the diplomatic work Togolese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing. You may not remember, but Togo was very instrumental in freeing military hostage from Ivory Coast, from the MINUSMA, in Mali. And they were also instrumental in the easing and the termination of the sanctions against Niger by ECOWAS. And they were mandated by the two parties to facilitate. So I know that they are not doing this out of just goodwill. It's just because they themselves are exposed to the jihadi contagion, but also to the political instability contagion. The regime in place is still there for 20 years. They are afraid that a coup may happen to them. So I like very much that they have been proactive diplomatically to find rapprochement between ECOWAS and the IS state. It's still not working, but I think regional actors and continental actors like ECOWAS, the EU, and the African Union may do well also to not neglect this conciliatory approach. It may sound defeating, but it will pay, I believe, in the middle to long term, because these states are neighbors. They will have to live together and fight terrorism together. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for highlighting the Lomé peace process. It actually came out of one of our executive in residence fellows here at the GCSP, Natasha Ridgko, who helped instrumentalize and build it together with Robert Doucet, as you mentioned, and we're very hopeful that this will continue this peace process, the Lomé peace process. I wanted to also call in Serge Stroobants back into the room. You as an expert on the MENA and on terrorism, I wanted to ask you, what do you think, given the situation of terrorism today, and the enduring need to have both an integrated hard and soft approaches to violent extremism, what do you think are the best ways to address these underlying structural grievances that are happening in the countries, and as you also know, and are an expert on climate change and how that has also weakened and created a lot of food and water insecurity in the region, which is helping to feed extremism. So what do you think would be the best response now that the West is not as involved as it was before? What can we do here in Geneva and in the global community and ECOWAS and AU? What can we do to stop this deadly spiral of extremism from continuing to grow?
Well, it's an excellent question. And of course, you need to look at the concentration I spoke about before. So basically look at the top 10 of the countries most impacted or the epicenter of terrorism in the Sahel region. I would answer in two ways or two parts of the answer. First of all, the answer about the reality on the ground where the West as such has lost their presence and has lost their influence and other actors. And I think we need to put that in a much broader context of a new world order, at least a redistribution of power or the new ways in which international relations are managed throughout the world, but definitely in this region. I think we have lost the opportunity to influence the region as such because we do not have boots on the ground anymore. And by this, I do not only mean the military, but also the capacity through political process, through really adapted development processes to increase the resilience of the societies in which we are witnessing in this part of the world. So we definitely need to understand the West, and calling from Brussels, it's really the right place to talk about this, is understanding the reality on the ground, the situation on the ground as it is today. Who are the main actors? Who are the main players? What is the interaction between the local governments? And you mentioned that there's quite a high level of turnover there in governments in the region, and all the actors on the ground, and also realize the very reduced power that we still have, the very reduced capacity to influence. So I think coming to terms with the reality of international relations today and how it affects certain regions of the world and our position as a Western entity and definitely as a European or European Union entity, we need to realize this and maybe review the way we are approaching development, the way we are approaching collaboration with certain regions in the world, and definitely the Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel region. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer, I think we need to, you spoke about the ecological threat report also there. So there we are really looking at the interplay between impact and resilience. Impact, of course, measured by different indicators of natural disasters and access to resources. And on the other hand, resilience measured by positive peace. So if you want to profoundly change the path that those countries are going to follow in the coming years, I think you need to provide a massive effort in making sure that you can do something about the impact. So clearly find solution to decrease the potential impact, being, as you said, from ecological threats or from violent extremism on one hand, and that's in a very systemic way, in a mid and long-term way. But I think much more important is increase the resilience of the societies in worldwide, but definitely in those regions most impacted. And I think we need to understand that the country engaged in or impacted by extreme violence or violent extremism, a country engaged in conflict is spending on average about 35 to 40% of the GDP to this conflict. So if you look at this, there are no financial assets to create a second priority, to create development, or to basically fight the impact of climate change. So I think this is where we need to find solutions with the international community and definitely Western countries to support the development of resilience of those countries. And of course, working for the Institute for Economics and Peace, I need to put the term positive peace on the ground, which is our analysis of attitudes, structures, and institutions we need to put in place to create peaceful societies, the systemic and conceptual definition of peace. And we see that countries doing this, we see an increase of positive peace, where we clearly see also an increase in a wide variety of economic and social indicators, which is a guarantee for an increased resilience. So I think the approach is double. We need to understand the rules of the game in which you play and your position on the chessboard, if you are on the chessboard, first of all. Second of all, you need to approach this in a dual way, but a very systemic and mid and long-term way, not just like quick impact and quick solutions for today. You need to make sure that you find solutions to decrease the impact, but you definitely, and I think that's the most important job you have to do, is to increase resilience, social resilience in those countries, to make sure that at some point the level of resilience is high enough for those societies to cope themselves with the impact of the threats they are facing.
Thank you so much, Serge. And I wanted to again highlight some positive developments here. The World Bank just recently held a fragility forum on the 27th through the 29th of March. It offered the opportunity for those who are working in these fragile areas to come together and to develop new ideas. So it invited government, civil society, and the private sector to exchange experiences in how to work in development interventions in the countries that are most fragile. So there's a really positive development there. There's also a new organization called Peace Invest, so Financing for Peace. It's an organization that is now creating peace bonds for a number of countries to create more value for stakeholders who are investing in countries that are suffering from fragility and literally helping to build back development. So there's two new initiatives, I think, that are very hopeful in this domain. I will now open the floor for questions. And I thank the audience for coming. We sometimes have less people in the room than we do online. I believe we have over 110 people online listening in. So I thank you so much for taking the time in your busy day to listen in on our presentations today. So the floor is open. You can introduce yourself if you'd like to, but you don't have to. Please go ahead.
Thank you for hosting this debate. It's really interesting. I have a couple of points. In the presentation of Mr. Serge, there was like a reference to terrorism, then political violence, then extreme violence or violence extremism. And sometimes it was like raised as one terminology, while we do understand it ends up with violence, but it's quite interesting to look at it with more nuance. It's really interesting to look on, to see one slide on the impact of October 7 on Israelis, an Israeli citizen, but it would have been also interesting to see what would be an assessment of people in the top 10 in the terrorist list on the impact of the genocide happening in Gaza today, on how it will be perceived in these top 10 perceived terrorist states and terrorist actors, and how it will go back to revitalize the dynamics in the region. And you mentioned a very interesting question, what we can do. I think in the absence of fairness on just resolutions in many places in the world and better improvement in governance, more PVE interventions, all of this effort without proper change in what is happening, the risk of terrorism, the risk of violence, the risk of whatever was named in that criteria will continue. And I think Mr. Serge has mentioned the loss of power from Western world. It's very interesting also to see whether because it was mentioned somewhere, Colombia on the list, the impact of the loss of credibility and the ability to stop genocides and political violence in the world on the whole global South. How the West can especially Europe, how can they regain their ability to be the ethical, moral compass for the world when all of this crimes and genocides are happening and no one, because you mentioned 10,000 by the end of the year, it's still happening and it's around 40,000 today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you asked one of the most difficult questions that I can imagine. May I ask Isaka, would you like to respond?
Not a response as such, but maybe a comment on, for instance, how I travel a lot in West Africa. I don't need. Okay. I travel a lot in West Africa, and I'm always interested in the perception, because perception is king or queen, and how people react to global events. Because we sometimes forget that my nephews, they are on TikTok, Tinder, and they are living in Ouagadougou where there is power cuts and internet cuts. So they're well informed. And when I discuss there is two topics that taking the way you put your question regarding the perception of the global South and credibility of Western partners, you have two issues. It's Ukraine and it's Gaza. A precision, most of the three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Burkina Faso has the least Islamized population. It's around 75. Mali, it's around 90. Niger, it's around 90 and something. That means that what's happening in the MENA region has an emotional, sometimes, effects on how people react. But this may depend also on the social categories people are on. If you talk to policymakers, he will say it's a pity. We are traditionally in support of this cause and this cause, but it's a pity we have our own problems to solve. So, but if you talk to, for instance, another segment of the population, if you go to mosque and so on, there you may feel you may have a feedback closer to the feelings you were evoking. Same on Ukraine. People tend to say, look, we are first on the GTI ranking. Do we have energy, time, and money to spend taking sides in a conflict where no one is caring about us? I'm relaying what people are telling me on the street and in policy circles. But then, it's, because Russia is growing a lot influent in our part of the world, sometimes we may not be as objective as we can be regarding how valuable partnership with Europeans and the Western part has been. Because let's take it at first value. In health, education, and trade, the Western part remain the part of the region where we export our commodities. Health investment, the EU. Education, the EU. But infrastructures and weapons that we need, it's coming from Russia and it's coming from China. So regarding your question, it's a mixed bag depending on who you talk to. But I join you in thinking that what Dr. Liang said, policymakers here may have to become more creative in how we navigate those feelings to propose transactions that feel profitable for both parties, but also feel respectful. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Serge, would you like to also respond to this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, as you say, it's the key question. Yeah, I think we showed the impact it has had on the Israeli population. But definitely, I mean, we also spoke very clearly about what we think the conflict or the military operations and the consequences of the military operation in Gaza will have on the long term. I think we have, in this region, we have seen over time a lot of peace initiatives, which were never successful. Even peace initiatives which received Nobel Peace Prizes were not successful. Why? Because there was never trust and confidence between both parties, especially on the security side. So when implementing, there was always something security-wise happening on one or the other side, generating response and escalation. And so I think that is what we are witnessing again. And depending on from what side you are looking at what is happening, we can understand that there should have been, we can understand the Palestinian reaction to the actions of Israel over time. Maybe shouldn't have been the one or certainly shouldn't have been the one we witnessed the 7th of October, which generated, of course, another reaction and escalation. So I think that's almost a systemic evolution over there. What I would like to say about this, and especially now again within this military operations, or what happened on the 7th of October, is this high level of this dehumanization of the other side. And I think that's something we need to address on both sides, and that's valid in the conflict between Palestine and Israel, but that's valid really in the majority of conflicts throughout the world. It's the dehumanization from the other side, of course, fueled by information, disinformation, fueled by propaganda, fueled by nationalist study, fueled by whatever. I think we need to stop doing this, because this is helping us, fall into the trap of terrorism, fall into the trap of violence, and and conflict and a generation of a high number of casualties worldwide also. So I think that's where we need to put a lot of efforts. It's stop the dehumanization, and it's grow. We need to grow the trust and confidence between parties. So that's why also, when I was listening to the GCSP specialist, I said, well, those are the kind of things we need to do. We need to create conditions for peace, and it's just not by shouting about, oh, let's create two states that are going to create peace. We've tried that in the past and it never worked. So there are different stages to achieve peace, and you need to start by stop dehumanizing. You need to realize that we are all a human race and it's humans on both sides. That's the first thing you need to do. And the second thing, you need to build trust and confidence to make sure that when you sign a peace agreement, you both want peace and you are both going to regulate security for the other one. It's an exchange of security and exchange of good practices. And once you can do that, then eventually, with the right investments, of course, linked again to what I explained about positive peace, you might eventually get into a more peaceful situation. But I think there's different steps and different stages before you reach this level. And the consequence of the current level of violence we see in this conflict, or the revival of violence we have seen in this conflict since October 7th, is only pushing us away from this solution. So the longer this is going to last, the deeper the cut will be, the more difficult it will be to come back to the state we were before October 7th and to try to find a peaceful solution. So so we need to stop this as soon as possible. We need to, of course, and I think you're absolutely right to point out some erratic approaches from some actors in the conflict, who are on one hand are still providing arms and ammunition, and on the other hand are trying to organize the humanitarian aid. I mean, I don't understand this. And of course, that's my personal opinion, but sometimes it doesn't match. And so you need to stop one and support the other, but do both at the same time doesn't make sense to me. So you clearly need to do the right things in the right manner and in a very, very systematic way to create the basis for peace. But you will not achieve peace just because you're going to create a two-state solution or whatever. You need to follow the right steps, create confidence, and bring people together as humans.
Thank you so much. A key message I think that we need to send is that a lot of countries still don't understand that authoritarian government systems do not work. People crave justice. They want political pluralism. They want to feel that they have a voice. State repression and human rights violations will continue to feed extremism, and authoritarian governments will not be able to win the hearts and minds of their people if they're not willing to do that, and they will have a successive coup d'etats that will just continue. So I hope that countries will think about that also into the future. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciated that you all stayed for this session. It's a lovely day outside, and please enjoy the sunshine. And thank you also for the speakers and all those who have organized. So Isako Adrugo, Kevin Osbert, thank you so much. And Serge Stroobants online, thank you for coming to see us through the digital domain. And I hope to see you next year in Geneva and in June for the Global Peace Index launch. So thank you so much. All the best to you. And thank you, Bérangère, for organizing everything for us. And Florian, thank you.